Good afternoon. Our topic for discussion is the audit process, accepting engagement. So the financial statement is the first factor in determining what to audit. And the management has different assertions. We call it the financial statement assertions. Assertions mean ito yung mga sinasabi ng management that we have done this to make the financial statements as fairly as possible, as fairly as presented. So management is responsible for the fair presentation of financial statements that reflect the nature and operations of the entity. So we have three groups of assertions. The first group are assertions about classes of transactions in events for the period under audit. So the occurrence, completeness, accuracy, cutoff, and classification. So under this class of assertion, as to occurrence, it says that transactions and events that have been recorded have occurred and pertain to the entity. So, sinasabi ng management na lahat ng mga recorded transactions nila ay yung para lang sa kanila. As to completeness, all transactions and events that should have been recorded have been recorded. So, everything has been recorded. Accuracy, amounts and other data relating to recorded transactions and events have been recorded appropriately. And cut off, transactions and events that have been recorded in the correct accounting period. Classification, transactions and events have been recorded in the proper accounts. So, yun yung mga example ng assertions ng management. The group B are assertions about account balances at the period. So, they have the assertions of existence, assets, liabilities, and equity, interests, exists, rights, and obligation. The entity holds or controls the rights to assets, and liabilities are the obligations of the entity. As to completeness, all assets, liabilities, and equity interests that should have been recorded have been recorded. As to valuation and allocation, assets, liabilities, and equity interests are included in the financial statements at appropriate amounts, and any resulting valuation or allocation adjustments are appropriately recorded. Then, the assertions about presentation and disclosure. So, tungkol naman ito sa tamang presentation ng mga financial statements at paglalagay ng full disclosure. So they have occurrence and rights and obligations. So they have disclosed events, transactions, and other matters have occurred and pertain to the entity. As to completeness, all disclosures that should have been included in the financial statements have been included. Classification and understandability, financial information is appropriately presented and described, and disclosures are clearly expressed. As to accuracy and valuation, financial or other information are disclosed fairly and appropriate amounts. So those are the different assertions. So what are the different audit procedures? So nasa procedures na tayo. Ano-ano yung pwedeng gawin ng auditor para mahanap niya ang mga kailangang ebidensya. So we call it the audit procedures. One is inspection. It involves examining of records, documents, or tangible assets. Observation consists of looking at a process or procedure being performed by others, like observing the physical count of inventory. Inquiry consists of seeking information from knowledgeable persons inside or outside the entity. So inquiry, you may ask from, for example, from the legal officers or the lawyers of the company if they have any pending lawsuit, or inquiry regarding accounts that affects the entity. Confirmation consists of the response to an inquiry to corroborate information contained in the accounting records. So confirmation, like confirmation of accounts receivable. For example, the auditor of our school may confirm with the students if the recorded accounts receivable of the students in the school is actually the accounts receivable as per record of each student. So that is confirmation. Computation consists of checking the arithmetical accuracy of source documents and accounting records or performing independent calculation. So computation means you would like to confirm or rather verify if the computation um, made by the company is correct. So you use the computation procedure. And analytical procedure consists of the analysis of significant ratios and trends, including the resulting investigation of fluctuations and relationships that are inconsistent with other relevant information or deviate from predicted amounts. So, ang analytical procedure ay parang you make an analysis kung ano yung mga posibleng nagbago, kakaiba from the previous reports of the client in comparison with the current financial statements or other reports. So that is analytical procedure. So mapapansin nyo na ang ating audit procedures ay mga usual or mga normal na procedure na ginagamit para makapaghanap ng sufficient evidence. Inspection, observation, inquiry, confirmation, computation, and analytical procedures. So what is evidence? Audit evidence refers to the information obtained by the auditor in arriving at the conclusions on which the audit opinion is based. Audit evidence will comprise source documents and accounting records underlying the financial statements and corroborating information from other sources. So, this evidence about the financial statements will either prove or disprove the validity of the management assertions that we have already discussed a while ago. So let us have the overview of the audit process. So the first is accepting an engagement. So this is the first step to make the decision of whether to accept or reject an audit engagement. So may karapatan din ng auditor na mag-reject or tanggapin ang isang client. So the process would require evaluation of the auditor's qualification as well as auditability of the prospective client's financial statement. Pwede bang ma-audit? Baka wala naman kayong documents na mahahanap. So, hindi siya auditable. A preliminary understanding of the client's business and background investigation of a prospective client are usually performed at this stage of the audit. The second of the audit process is the audit planning. So after the auditor have decided whether to accept or reject the client. So kung i-accept niya na ang client, kailangan niya na ng planning. So the auditor obtains more detailed knowledge about the client's business and industry in order to understand the transactions and events affecting the financial statements and to identify potential problems that might be encountered during the audit. A preliminary assessment of risk and materiality should also be made to be able to develop an overall audit strategy and a detailed approach for the expected conduct and the scope of the examination. The third audit process is considering the internal control. So the auditor will have to study the internal control of the entity because the internal control of the entity will determine or will directly affect the reliability of the financial statements under audit. So it means mas maganda ang internal control ng isang client ay magbibigay ito ng assurance about the reliability of accounting data and financial statements. So, gano'n naman talaga. Pag maganda ang control system, mas malamang may record ng maayos ang mga transactions. So, the consideration of internal control involves obtaining understanding of the entity's control system and assessing the level of control risk. So, the risk that the client's internal control may not prevent or detect material misstatements in the financial statements. So, yun yung tinatawag nating control risk. Yun daw, control system ng company ay hindi ma-detect. Wala siyang kakayahang ma-detect ang material misstatements in the financial statement. So we call it the control risk. If the auditor wants to assess control risk at less than high level, sufficient appropriate evidence must be obtained to prove that the internal control is functioning effectively and that it can be relied upon. This evidence can be obtained by performing tests of controls. Number 4 is performing substantive tests. So, tapos na yung kanyang planning na reconsider niya na ang internal control, gaano karaming ebidensya ang kailangan niya. So, nandito na siya sa pag-perform ng substantive test. Ito na yung actual na gathering ng evidence. So, using the information obtained in audit planning and consideration of internal control, the auditor performs substantive tests to determine whether the entity's financial statements are presented fairly in accordance with financial reporting standards. These procedures would involve examination of the documents and evidence supporting the amounts and disclosures in the financial statements. The extent of substantive test is highly dependent on the result of the auditor's consideration of internal control. Based on the evaluation of internal control, the auditor had obtained evidence that the internal control is functioning effectively. the scope of the auditor's substantive test can be reduced. On the other hand, if the result of test of control prove that the internal control is weak, the auditor will have to compensate for this weakness by performing more extensive substantive procedures. So we are now in the completion of the audit. Then, in the completion of the audit, dapat ay meron na siyang sapat na or sufficient appropriate evidence in order to reach a conclusion on the fairness of the financial statements. After the auditor has completed testing the account balances, the auditor performs additional audit procedures to complete the audit and become satisfied that the evidence gathered is consistent with the auditor's report. These procedures include review of subsequent events and contingencies, assessing the going concern assumption, performing overall analytical review procedures, and obtaining written representations from the client's management. And issuing the report. So this is the end product of the process. On the basis of audit evidence gathered and evaluated, the auditor forms a conclusion about the financial statements. This conclusion, in the form of an opinion, is communicated to various interested users through an audit report. So that is the overview of the audit process.